Ready?
Yes.
Good morning. I'm Dave Anderson, and I serve as chair for the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. I ask the members of the board to respond to a roll call to signify their presence at this open meeting that is being conducted in hybrid form with some individuals remote by conference call or other electronic medium, and some individuals present at the board's office. Denise Seisman.
Present.
Jill Flessing.
Present.
Linda Heitzman Powell.
Present.
Donna Honer Queel.
Present.
Mary Jones.
Present.
Jim Kilmartin.
Present.
Richard Nobles.
Present.
Andrea Perdomo Morales.
Present.
Cynthia Shindo.
Present.
Thank you. Laura Shaughnessy.
Present.
David Stevens.
Here.
I note the following staff members are also present. David Fye. Here. Leslie Allen.
Here.
Cindy DeArcle.
I do see that Cindy's present.
Thank you. Tim Resner, serving as legal counsel for the board, is also present.
Here.
Next, David Fye will read a message concerning this meeting being held remotely.
This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the board about its concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or KOMA, does not require the board to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the Executive Director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. One individual has been approved for 10 minutes to present information on disciplinary tools for licensing boards. Because we are conducting this public meeting in hybrid form, I state for the record the following information. Access to this meeting is being conducted in person and by means of interactive communication by the conference call and YouTube channel that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting. While the meeting is conducted in hybrid form, the requirements of the KOMA are not suspended. As such, we will be connecting this meeting pursuant to the KOMA. On March 12th, 2025, we sent notice of the board meeting to all individuals who had requested notice of such meetings. The notice was also posted on the board's website, ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other meeting material have been posted on the board's website and are available for review. You may also request a copy of the agenda specifically by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with a subject line request for the agenda, and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and YouTube channel that allows the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if we have any technical issues during the meeting, you may send an email to bsrb@ks.gov. The recording of this meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And we did check the conference call line before we got started. There's no one currently on the line, but if I hear someone leap over and announce themselves, I will let you.
Thank you, Dave. The meeting is now called to order and the board will begin its discussion of the first item on its agenda. Has everybody had an opportunity to look at the agenda? Any issues that you'd like to add to that? If not, I would accept a motion to approve the agenda.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Second.
Thank you. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. Thank you. The motion's passed. This takes us to our public comment. Good morning, Bradley.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, welcome to the board.
Thrilled to be here. I'll go ahead and get started. Feel free if you guys have questions. Obviously, feel free to ask after. Let me share my screen so you guys can see the presentation.
And for individuals online or there were some additional materials that were sent out this morning as well, and one of these is a copy of this packet, so you should have this in your materials for the board meeting as well.
Thank you, David. Can you confirm that the eBOS presentation is showing on the screen?
Yes, it is.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to present today. My name is Bradley Guy. I serve as the head of sales and business development for the EBOS, and I'm excited to introduce you to EBOS. EBOS is an acronym for Ethics Boundaries Assessment Services. EBOS is a specialized scenario-based exam designed to evaluate a professional's understanding of ethical conduct, boundary issues, and decision-making within their scope of practice. Regulatory boards across the country, including those in nursing, chiropractic, counseling, and physical therapy, among others, use EBOS as part of their disciplinary, reinstatement, and remedial education processes. It provides a standardized, objective way to assess ethical competency and guide appropriate corrective action when ethical lapses occur. This tool has proven highly effective for boards seeking to support professional accountability while also offering a clear path for rehabilitation and return to safe practice. First, I want to go through the footprint of where EBOS currently is being utilized among healthcare boards. So you can see over 37 healthcare and non-healthcare professions have utilized EBOS in their remediation and path back to licensure. It's been trusted by over 150 regulatory boards in the United States, encompassing the states shaded in yellow. We do have 5 domains. When you think of domains, think of subjects, which I'll get into in a little bit. We do have over 550 customizable scenarios, which encompass the assessment of EBOS. You will see Kansas is shaded. We currently do work with the chiropractic board, nursing board, and among others as well within the state of Kansas. So happy to pass along any referrals if needed. So what is the problem? 23%, almost 1 in 4, have personally seen or been involved in an unethical behavior nationwide. Nearly 60% of all misconduct observed in the workplace is never even reported. Just like you, we are here to protect the public and provide them a path back to licensure. I always like to pause here for a second and say, it's a commonly used phrase. I've given a presentation to over 60 unique healthcare and non-healthcare boards this year so far, and almost all of them, they all say, we're here to protect the public. My question to you is simply assigning a webinar doing the job to protect the public? Or do you need to measure not only their critical thinking, but decision-making of your licensees before they return to practice? At the end of the day, EBOS stands as the gold standard in remediation ethics and boundaries essay assessments. Just want to go over quickly the webinar ineffectiveness. Over 91% of webinar attendees admit to multitasking during the session. Retention rates for passive learning opportunities such as webinars is estimated between 5 and 10%. And webinars are often ineffective at driving actual behavioral change or applied skills, particularly in professional development, because there's no hands-on component or follow-up reinforcement. I think we're all guilty of that, right? We all hit the arrows. We all try to take the quizzes, get through them as quickly as possible. And so again, I stress to you as the board, are we doing enough by assigning simply a webinar and checking a box saying that they are good to go to return to practice? So what's the solution? I'm here to present to you about EBOS. EBOS is partnered with the regulatory community, as you've heard, offering a customized scenario-based essay exam that ultimately measures a licensee's critical thinking and decision-making in a professional setting. We do have 5 domains, as I talked about, or assessment areas: fraud, boundaries, substance abuse, unprofessional conduct, and professional standards. So you as a board would get to select and customize which domains that you want the licensee to take. There are tremendous benefits of multiple domains as you're able to get a more accurate representation of the licensee's moral and ethical compass. Now, keep in mind, there is no cost to you as the board to ever use this product. It is simply a cost burden by the licensee, similarly to them paying for a webinar or mediation credit. These are our 5 assessment areas and some examples that you can see within each assessment area. This is not an exhaustive list. It's simply just an example of what we have seen. We have seen everything and anything, as you can imagine. And so we try to just give you some guidance on where to steer you in terms of assessment areas. We definitely want this to be a collaborative approach. So we're happy and we work commonly with clients so that they can reach out. We can give them a recommendation of which assessments to use. It's also important because then we can tailor the scenarios to the actual licensee and make sure they're similar to the violation that they did or performed. So I just want to talk through some case studies that our clients have recently done. We had a recent dental board license or survey all their remediation candidates in 2024, and over 80% of the licensees identified EBOS as having the most profound impact. And that's substantial. That's 4 out of 5 licensees as part of the remediation identifying EBOS. And so I simply reached out and I would talk to these licensees and I'd say, what is the reason? Why was EBOS such a powerful tool for you? And it was fascinating. A lot of them came back and said, I knew what I did was wrong. I just didn't know to what extent and how many people it affected. And that's usually powerful, right? It's usually you see somebody come in front of the board that they can be initially met with denial or defensive, being defensive. And what we want them to do is we're not here to slap them on the hand. We're here to teach them so that when a decision like another ethical scenario comes into play, that they make a better informed decision because of EBOS. I'll get into the structure of the exam in a little bit, but we do ask them to identify some consequences and solutions as well as part of the scenario. I also want to identify one other thing. The same board did a 30-minute webinar, and they did an AI facial recognition. And the average amount of time that a licensee paid attention to an ethics webinar that was required for them to complete to attract facial activity on the screen, the average amount of time in the 30-minute time slot was 6 minutes. Now think about that, 6 minutes of the 30, and they're bringing a certificate back to you saying that they're that they're ethically competent and that they're able to return to practice. It's pretty substantial. A couple of referrals below just talks about the satisfaction that boards have using EBOS. I talked about critical thinking. It also promotes sound decision making. This is not going to be your typical Tom stole from the grocery store type of scenario. Every single scenario is tailored towards occupation and violation. They all do come from a prior board order, so they are all real world scenarios. So what does the testing process look like? I talked about payment. It is just to put a number on it, is $400 per assessment. And that is, again, paid by the licensee. So you as a board would order the exam as part of a consent agreement or part of a remediation strategy. The licensee would then register for the EBOS exam on the website, ebos.org. They would select which domains they have to take. We have partnered with Prometric Testing Center so that they take the exams in person, and it is done on a computer. They are allowed 60 minutes to complete the exam. No electronic devices are allowed. We did have someone show up about a month ago with smart glasses and was caught trying to communicate to get answers through the ethics exam. So it goes to show you just to what extent people are willing to take shortcuts on not only any exam, but an ethics-based exam as well. So I shouldn't be surprised, but I always like to bring it up just so we know what we're dealing with. Then the licensee goes and takes the exam in their local community. As I said, they're allowed 60 minutes. They get to pick a schedule and the time of what works best for their schedule. Results are then sent to you as the board directly and the licensee within 7 to 10 business days. So you can see it's a very customizable, hands-off process for you. You're able to identify someone from the board to get the results, which then kind of takes a deeper dive into the proficiencies and inefficiencies of the licensee's answers. So who grades the exams and we talked about the costs, so I won't spend too much time there. We do have a grading panel, roughly about 12 graders that all come from regulatory experience. So whether that's a lawyer, attorney, executive director. So it is a very objective process from the standpoint that no names are shared, no states are shared. It is all anonymized. The only thing the grader does see is the licensee's answers. With our psychometrician support, we do go through we do go through test calibration exercises on an annual basis to ensure consistency among the graders, fairness among the questions. We do take this very seriously. So each test is assigned 2 graders, and then if adjudication is needed, then we bring in a senior grader to weigh one way or the other. It is a legally defensible exam. You can see the fairness, reliability, consistent, and validity aspect of the exam as well. Here's our testing rubric. I don't expect people to pull out a magnifying glass, so I'm just going to talk through the structure of it. There are 4 sections: introductory opinion statements, consequences, solutions, and public relations. going across the rows, going down is scores 1 through 4. There is a maximum of 16, with 12 being a passing score. It is important to point out that spelling, grammar, punctuation are not heavily graded. It is strictly content that is going to be graded on the exam. This is a sample, just a question that a licensee would face. This is a chiropractic specific question. We do have many other professions and occupations that we tailor these to. I just want to focus, you guys can read the scenario. I want to focus on the 4 sections below. You can see where we're asking them to present several statements, not only in identifying what the ethical issue is in the introductory opinion section, but if you look in the consequences and solution, we're also asking them to present several consequences and several solutions, many of which the licensees actually have told me that they will use going back into their practice. So that's where the learning really takes effect. The last section is unique because it talks and makes the licensee understand who the minor and major stakeholders are and who the ethical violation ultimately affects. So it's not just a patient professional type ethical violation. A number of our situations involve insurance agencies or families, and then they're asked to identify how it affects the community safety and welfare. So pretty powerful. As we start to close out, how does EBOS help you as a board? It does provide a thorough review in the report of the exam candidate's ethical and moral compass. It provides a comprehensive assessment of the ethical competency of the professional and offering a deeper insight into the critical thinking abilities. It also does provide the regulatory board cost savings and time savings by simplifying the professional misconduct process while offering an independent regulatory board, being us, to measure their ethics so that you don't have to. And ultimately, it does not give the regulatory board confusion on the thoroughness of what the required ethics task is or what next steps are. In closing, EBOS is more than an exam. It's a proactive solution to a complex challenge. It empowers boards like yours with an objective, consistent, and legally defensible assessment that promotes accountability and professional growth. We believe, like it has with so many other boards, it can enhance your regulatory toolkit by providing valuable insights into an individual's ethical reasoning and readiness to return to safe professional practice. Thank you again for your time and consideration. I welcome any questions that you guys have.
Thank you, Mr. Guy. Questions from members of the board?
I
I
have
have
a
a
question.
quick, Denise, go ahead, please.
Okay, so when a licensee takes an assessment, completes an assessment, how many scenarios do they review and provide responses to?
So it is, depending on how many assessments you ask the board or you ask the licensee to do, it is 1 scenario per assessment.
Thank you, first of all, for coming this morning. I appreciate the presentation. And I know that you had mentioned briefly matters of cost. I'm wondering what a common cost or an average cost might be for a licensee, and if the cost is moderated by the number of scenarios that they have to complete. So if it's 2 scenarios, it's higher than 1 scenario.
Yeah, it really, it's a great question. It really depends on, I'll call it the severeness of the ethical violation. So we'll have some boards that'll assign 5, 6, 7 assessments that they have to complete. We usually, our average is right around 2 per licensee. So in theory, it would be $800 for the licensee to complete it. So it's $400 per assessment. I do want to be clear on that piece. I'd say the average is 2. We do certainly have licensing boards that do 1. We certainly have licensing boards that do many more than 2 as well. So it really kind of ultimately depends on A, the egregiousness of what the ethical violation was, and B, how severe and how much assessment is the licensee actually needs.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? All right. Thank you, Mr. Guy. Appreciate it.
Thank you, guys, and I'll be in touch with follow-up. I appreciate it.
Okay, we will move on to review and approval of the minutes from the March 10th board meeting. Has everybody had an opportunity to review those? Any changes to those minutes? Seeing none, I would accept a motion.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. We have a motion to approve the agenda. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Thank you. The motion has passed. Next, we'll move to the executive director's report. Dave?
All right, thank you, Dave. I know we have a number of items on the agenda today, so I will try to highlight some of these things a little more quickly than normal, and if you have questions, let me know. In terms of operations here, under the heading of outreach, I always like to provide an update on our YouTube broadcast of board meetings and advisory committee meetings. We have reached the 200 meeting broadcast mark, which is great. Those meetings have been viewed over 11,100 times. So really pleased to see the number continuing to grow and more people becoming aware of the work the board is doing and then the advisory committees are doing. Another way that we are providing outreach, we'll have this a little bit later on the agenda, but we recently concluded our surveys to 6 of the professions that we license and regulate. In the past, we had done surveys for the social work profession, and last year, a lot of the advisory committees worked on drafting questions for a survey for the other professions. And while there were some unique questions, we did strive to have some uniformity. So later in the agenda, we'll go over a bit of a comparison report, or at least part 1 of that report. But we did wrap up the survey to licensees, and during the last month's advisory committee, we started to present draft reports on all the survey results to the advisory committees. So really happy with the responses so far. Concerning updates on revenue and expenditures, unfortunately, given how quickly this meeting was in the month of May, we don't have current month or previous month expenditure information, but the last month that we did have good information, we were right around where we had started the fiscal year. So I would expect our expenditures are going to be probably around, or our expenditures for the year are between 1 million, 1.1 million, 1.2 million. I imagine our balance probably by the end of the year will be somewhere around 1.8 million. And so roughly about 1.5 times our yearly budget. In terms of other items for operations, we are undergoing a transition to the Acela licensing platform, and staff are here at the BSRB are continuing to meet with representatives from the Office of Information Technology Services, trying to capture all of our existing forms, our processes. There's a lot of work being done behind the scenes, and we will let you know when some of that starts to appear on our website. And we're still probably about 1.5 years away from fully moving over to the Acela system, but everything is moving forward well with that. We are starting to plan the out-of-town planning meeting for the board this year. We are looking at holding that in Manhattan, Kansas this year. We have been in conversation with some different locations, possibly to hold that. And it appears that there is a lot of availability. So I think our next step will be that we will send a message out to board members and pull them to find dates where they are available. So we would really like all board members to be able to attend this meeting in person. It's the one meeting per year where the board really comes together and holds an all-day meeting. Sometimes a little bit longer than 1 day, but I'll go ahead and start looking to identify dates where there's no conflicts with the BSRB calendar, and then I'll send that out to all of you so you can provide some input on that. But we're looking to do it where we normally would be doing it, which would be roughly the very end of September or sometime in early October. Another item I wanted to comment on for operations, the advisory committees are approaching the end of the fiscal year, and you may recall advisory committee members serve 2-year terms. So we are doing a good job of reaching out to the current members that are eligible for reappointment to see if they are interested in seeking reappointment, and a number of them are listed on the agenda for reappointment at this meeting. Additionally, there are some members that have either chosen not to seek reappointment or are reaching the end of their eligibility to serve. And so we will be sending out a message to licensees to recruit new members to the advisory committees. Generally, how this happens is they submit a letter of interest and a resume or CV. And those are provided to each of the different advisory committees to review and then discuss openly at a public meeting. And so that is likely to take place at the June meetings. So after this meeting, until the June meeting, we'll be reaching out, collecting that information. So there can be some discussions at the June advisory committee meetings. And then just last, just for your calendars and preparation, our statutes do state that the board will elect a chair and a vice chair at the first meeting after the start of the fiscal year. So we do that every July. So that would be our next meeting, since we are in the May meeting now. So just wanted to put that on your radar. That'll be coming up at the next board meeting in July. Turning now to some legislative updates. The legislative session concluded about a month ago. In terms of the budget process, the BSRB budget, the legislature approved the same amounts that we have requested. Now, we don't receive any money from the legislature, but we do submit a proposed limit on how much we can spend in any given fiscal year. This year, we were asked to make adjustments to the current year, which is fiscal year 25, and also put forward a proposed budget for 26 and 27. And the amounts that we have requested were approved by both the House and the Senate. And so, and there's no special language that was added. So we are moving forward with that. The next step after the end of the fiscal year will be that we'll be preparing for adjustments for fiscal year 26 and 27, and will be officially asked to submit a new budget revised estimate by September 15th. So that'll be the next step. But at least for right now, the legislative session is done and our budget has concluded for the year. In terms of some other legislative updates, I do want to update you on a few bills which we have talked about over the spring. One of those bills is House Bill 2274, which would remove active from the requirement of military service members for occupational licensure and waiver of military spouse licensing fees. But with that, basically, that's the official description. But essentially what that bill would do is, if that bill had passed, currently right now, if there are military spouses of active service members, their licensing fees are waived. With this bill, you would have the word active removed from that section of the statute. So it would apply to military spouses, whether their spouse was on active duty or not. And so House Bill 2274 did not pass, but before the session was over, that language was moved to House Bill 2280, which was passed. So we are preparing for this. It will become effective upon publication of the statute book, which is generally July 1st. Senate Bill 63 is the Help Not Harm legislation that had to do with prohibiting certain kind of care and treatment for minors seeking gender identity reaffirmation type treatment. We've received a few questions about this bill. You may recall the specific language in the bill did not make direct references to BSRB licensees, but there are references in the bill to healthcare providers and practitioners and healthcare services. So the BSRB does not provide legal guidance to individuals, and we don't interpret statutes. So if there are individuals who have remaining questions, since this bill has been passed, it was vetoed by the governor, but the veto was overridden. If individuals or licensees do have questions on that, they may consider consulting with private or their own personal legal counsel, as that may be beneficial. And that's the standard guidance we would provide to most people if they had questions about interpreting a certain statute. In terms of other bills we had discussed this year, Senate Bill 128 would have created an exception for certain mandatory reporting obligations for social workers when working under the supervision of an attorney. I wanted to let you know that bill did not pass this year. So that bill did essentially die on the calendar. So that bill is dead for this session. Senate Bill 229 would have created a sunset provision for occupational licensing requirements. So they would have automatically terminated after 5 years unless explicitly extended by legislation. However, there were several exempt agencies from that legislation, including the BSRB. That bill, Senate Bill 229, did not pass. So that bill is dead for this session as well. And Senate Bill 256, that was a back to work bill. It would have eliminated most remote work. Although there were ways to grant exemptions or exceptions. The bill did not pass. In the appropriations bill for both chambers, they did include some language on back to work, and their final position was over the next year, they're going to study how state agencies are utilizing telework. And potentially there could be future changes, but at least for the next year, their solution to this issue at the moment is to study how it's being used and then maybe reconsider something in the future. Moving next to some association updates, a number of the national associations were holding mid-year meetings. I was able to attend the mid-year meeting for the Association of State and Provincial Psychology Boards, which was in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. And I was asked to be a presenter. I presented on two different topics, customer service and also that of composite boards. And I think both of those presentations were well received. I was able to attend that meeting with board member David Stevens, and I just wanted to defer to David Stevens if you had any comments on that meeting of the ASPPB Association. You might want to share something with the board concerning that experience.
Well, it was very educational. The thing that always is highlighted is David gave those two presentations, and he is just very well regarded among his peers, and so that is a really strong thing for the state. There are a lot of interesting topics that they were reviewing, and many of which we're dealing with here. So I think it's very valuable for him to be as plugged in as he is, and I certainly was educated in areas that as a non-professional, it was helpful for me. So I really appreciate the opportunity to go.
Well, thank you, David, and really appreciated you attending that meeting. And I can say, to your comments, it is interesting. There is a trend, I think, nationally, where a lot of states are at least having conversations about moving to a composite type structure like the BSRB has. I think there's a number of efficiencies that we have based on having several different professions combined into one board, but also, being able to have a staff. And a number of states are recently having this conversation, and we come from a different perspective since the BSRB has been a composite board for 45 years. But I'm happy to help out other states as they are moving to that different transition. Another mid-year meeting was the Association of Social Work Boards. I was able to attend an administrator workshop, which was in Washington, D.C., which was a good training. It was interesting. I've been with the board just a little bit under 5 years as executive director, but they had all of us that were attending that workshop, which is the first time they've offered it in about 10 years. And about 25 of us were present. And I was about fifth from the end in terms of most senior members of executive directors. So I don't consider myself a senior executive director, but there has been a lot of turnover in other states in terms of people moving from different boards or because of structures changing. And so I do find now that attending some of these meetings, we go always trying to collect information and bring it back. But frequently right now, we become more of a resource to help out other states and other licensing boards by providing them copies of our policies. And we're really happy to do that. But it's a good reflection on where we stand so far with a lot of the good improvements we've made. So I did attend that mid-year meeting with Cynthia Schindel, and I wanted to refer to Cynthia to see if she wanted to share any comments with the board about attending that mid-year meeting.
Yes, it was a very interesting meeting. I think it was in Portland, though. You said DC, David.
Oh,
So
Portland was the mid-year meeting, yes.
yeah, right. So yeah, it was all the states that were represented there, almost all of them were dealing with similar issues. Many of their states have passed laws that are perceived as harmful to our clients, like the anti-trans laws that our state has passed. Also, the trend that David mentioned, moving towards composite boards. There's a lot of hand-wringing and angst among some of those states that have not been a combined board before. And yeah, so it was useful for Kansas to be able to provide the perspective of having been a composite board for so many years. One of the foci of the meeting was really the importance of data. There was a social work census that was done by ASWB, and they got 40,000 responses, which was a really good response. And what it showed was that the government numbers that are, describing how many social workers there are and what average salaries are way incorrect, because they only include reported social work employees, not private practitioners. And there are a high percentage of social workers across the country that are in private practice. So her data indicated much higher numbers of social workers because it did include private practitioners and also a higher average salary there, but it was still only about 10% of the projected social workers in the country. So there's definitely a need for more data. And I imagine that that's the case across the other mental health professions as well. The other focus was talking about the test because, of course, a couple of years ago when the data came out about differential pass rates for the ASWB exam based on both race and age. And also, I think there was also a regional difference in pass rates. There was a strong presentations about the necessity to help all social workers pass the test, that the educators talked about needing to really teach that it will take persistence and study, and you might have to take the test multiple times, but that we should be committed to helping all social workers pass who want to take the exam and pass it. But there was also some opposing view that because of foundational racism in the US, that there should be and other disabilities that maybe exist for people, that there should be alternative paths. So that was not, there were more people that were advocating for we need to create whatever tools necessary to help everyone pass the exam who wants to. But there was some of that opposing viewpoint that was also presented. And then they talked about the collaboration between regulators and schools and the ASWB in creating successful social workers. It was a very good educational meeting. I was glad to be able to attend. And likewise, David is the treasurer in ASWB and widely respected in that organization as well. So we are very fortunate to have David at the helm.
Well, thank you, Cynthia. And I'll say just from some of the sessions that I was in as well, one of them had a real strong call for workforce data. And they were proposing some ways in which states could start to collect that. So the fact that our survey really targets a lot of those same areas made me feel like we're right on track, if not ahead of where a lot of the other states are in terms of answering that call and trying to be helpful in solutions. So appreciate you sharing your comments from the meeting. And I was also able to attend a meeting of behavior analyst regulators and the Association of Professional Behavior Analysts Convention with Linda Heitzman Powell. And I wanted to refer to Linda to see if she had any comments from her takeaways from that meeting that she could share with the board.
It was, focused just like all the other professions on the potential harmful and negative impact of the legislation that's coming out across the United States and how we could combat that. It really was focused on maintaining a positive attitude and, just the premise of being kind to each other. The actual regulatory meeting that we went to, the Behavior Analyst Certification Board took language out of their educational requirements in terms of continuing ed, of language related specifically to DEI, because it's such a hot buzzword right now, and they reframed it in terms of inclusion, including everybody. They felt like it was a way to be able to require that people still did not discriminate based on any identifying characteristics, but they thought that it would prevent any sort of negative pushback from people who support that kind of legislation. All in all, it was it was a good group of people that were focused on not only inclusion and how to combat the wave of potential hate crimes that could be coming out across the country, but also a way of looking at how that legislation could potentially be traumatizing to people, and how we could embrace a trauma-informed approach to behavior analysis, so that we're taking some of that into consideration as we move forward. So in spite of everything, it was a really positive conference and was focused on inclusivity instead of exclusivity. So, anything else, David? I know you look at it from a different lens sometimes.
I do. I appreciate your comments on that. And one of my major takeaways from attending the meetings with the regulators and the other conference was in the behavior analysis profession, there's a group of technicians called RBTs. And I'm always interested in looking at that group because, we never want to be behind where other states are. But, there's only one state to my knowledge that is currently licensing that level of technician, and most states are monitoring. And I think that's where we're at right now too. So I don't think we're behind. I think we're right in alignment with where that trend is. And I think our discussions about unprofessional conduct are the same sort of conversations a lot of other states are having right now too. So thought it was very helpful. And I think it's important that we continue to connect with other states that license behavior analysts to make sure that we can continue to learn from each other.
Absolutely. And the thing with the that technician level, that from the Behavior Analyst Certification Board, they're called RBTs, Registered Behavioral Technicians. And there are states that require a certain level of competency, like 40 hours of training. That includes a skill-based competency that goes along with it, but they call them BTs, behavioral technicians, instead of registered behavioral technicians, because a registered behavioral technician needs to sit for that qualifying national exam and pass it. And then they have to be under the supervision of a BCBA that signs off on their hours each month, that says, I provided X number of supervision hours to this individual. And it's pretty rigorous. Not all states require BCBAs to be able to provide services to individuals. So it doesn't make sense to have an RBT requirement if you don't require a BCBA, right? So, like David said, I think we're right in line with the other states, keeping an eye on it, but not having it be something we monitor or oversee.
I appreciate you sharing your comments from that conference. I know we have a number of items on the agenda today, so I will not touch upon any of the other updates that are highlighted in my report, except for one thing I did want to share with you. About a year ago, I was asked to serve as the treasurer for the American Association of State Counseling Boards, and I was elected for the first time to that position in January of this year. And just to kind of show you some of the benefits of taking on that responsibility and learning from that. In that role as treasurer, I've tried to learn some skills in this role as executive director for the BSRB, but also we had a dues conversation recently for that association, whether that should be increased or not. I was able to suggest to that group about a year ago a change in their investment strategy, and they were able to invest in a 12-month CD instead of doing money market, and the amount of savings that they were able to get, or I guess additional revenue, made up for any kind of an increase that increasing their fee to all the states would have been. So they were able to keep that fee flat because of some of the extra income they were able to get from just a change in their investment strategy. So just kind of wanted to share one of the practical things, one of the benefits of taking one of these roles, and how service to some of these associations can have a good impact back to us as a licensing board as well. So wanted to share that. I know that there's an update on here for some of the compacts. The social work multi-state compact, I'm on the rules committee and the finance committee, and we're continuing to meet, but otherwise I don't have any updates. Richard and Laura, I was curious if either of you have any updates you wanted to share on the counseling compact or the SIPAC compact.
Richard, go ahead. Yeah.
So our mid-year meeting is coming up. I believe it's in about a month and a half. And I will get more information about what has been going on with SIPAC. I've been receiving numbers of the individuals who um, are licensed or who have practiced under SIPAC over the course of the last year. And I think that there were 70, was it two, David?
That sounds
Something.
about right.
So there are 72 individuals um, that are psychologists that are practicing with SIPAC in the state of Kansas. And I would say that's been kind of the biggest update that I have received thus far. David, would you say that there's anything else that you got from Gina Polk or?
No, I think that was a good update. And like you mentioned, the next mid-year meeting will be in July. And so later on in the agenda, we will highlight the date for the next board meeting. And we did ask that that board meeting be moved so that it wouldn't conflict with the SIPAC mid-year meeting to make sure that you as commissioner would be able to attend that meeting. So we appreciate you referencing that total of the number of individuals practicing and providing services into the state. That does help provide care for the individuals seeking care in Kansas. And so appreciate you sharing it.
No, absolutely. Thank you. Laura.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I spoke with Greg Searles briefly last week just to make sure I was up to date about the counseling compact, and my report is pretty straightforward. They are working to have a late fall rollout for the counseling compact, and that's it. So they're rolling along.
Well, I will say, in terms of the Kansas Fights Addiction Grant Review Board, you have an update from Jason Hess in your packet. But I do just want to say, I know that you as board members are incredibly busy, and this is not a board where we ask you to attend one meeting every other month, and that's the limit of your service. You do a lot for us. So thank you for that. But I also appreciate really kind of, as I've made the effort to go and attend some of these association meetings and get plugged in, I really appreciate all of you getting plugged in, whether you are attending some of these meetings, whether you are volunteering on committees, whether you are serving as commissioners. I think you're really doing a great job. So appreciate you taking active roles in these areas. And if I could do more to support you, just let me know. But with that, I'll go ahead and end my report and see if there's any questions.
Thank you, Dave. Any questions for Dave? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to staff reports. Leslie?
I don't have anything. I have regs later on in the meeting, so.
Very good. Cindy? I think you're muted.
That's it. Cindy, you're currently muted.
And I apologize again. In your information, there are statistics that we compile each month about the complaints the board receives and the decisions that the complaint review committee makes. The fiscal year ends at the end of June. The average number of complaints that we have had for the past 3 years is 204. As you can see, at the end of April, we have received 217 complaints for fiscal year 205. So that means that we will have considerably more complaints this fiscal year.
Anyone on the board have questions for Cindy?
I don't have questions at all, but I would just once again like to thank the Complaint Review Committee for the work that they put in. It's a lot of work to review cases and to get through a substantial amount of cases and reading. So just a thank you to serve on that committee. Much appreciated.
All right, we'll move to the Complaint Review Committee report.
I think that was just what Cindy had up there.
Okay, that's it. Then we'll move to professions report, start with licensed psychology.
Good morning again, all. The Licensed Psychology Advisory Committee met on Tuesday, the 29th of April, 2025 at 6 p.m. And I appreciate those who who were in attendance at the meeting. It was rescheduled from an earlier date, and that's because I had some things that were going on. So I appreciate the accommodations from the rest of the committee. We had a couple of different discussions, one pertaining to the postdoc requirement for licensed psychologists, or not quite licensed psychologists, and whether or not we would want to combine predoctoral hours with postdoctoral hours so that prospective licensees might be able to use the hours that they had accumulated previous to internship to count towards their total experience in terms of hours. And Leslie is going to do a bit more research on what other states are doing when it comes to the categorization of hours, and how things are handled in other ways across the United States. And I just want to thank, excuse me, I just want to thank Leslie for taking on that task. I know that it takes a lot to do the type of research that you have been doing, and that you have offered to continue to do in that regard. So thank you so much for the work that you've done. We also took a look at the survey that was sent out to psychologists earlier in the year, and we reviewed a whole number of the responses that came through, and there were a number of recommendations, and we will continue to look at, even later on today, we'll continue to look at a bit of what the surveys reveal. And lastly, that's actually just about it, I would say. Our next meeting is going to be on, excuse me, Tuesday, the 10th of June, 2025 at 6 p.m.
Thank you. We'll move to social work.
Social Work Advisory Committee did not meet in April. We will be meeting in June. And at that time, we'll continue some of our discussion about AI. And I did just want to add to my earlier report that there were a couple of presentations on AI at the ASWB meeting. And one of them provided an informed consent form, a model informed consent form for the use of AI, which I thought was very helpful. And I was going to ask David if he could distribute that to everyone so that you could take a look at that in your advisory committees. It covers a lot of the risks and potential benefits of the use of AI and some of the broad applications of it. So we will be discussing that in our June meeting for social work.
Thank you. Professional counseling.
Thank you. Professional Counselors Advisory Committee met on April 1st. And the first thing we did, we reviewed the counseling compact update, of which again, there's not much going on with that right now. Old business, we talked about AI as an ongoing topic because of course it evolves. And so I really look forward to the information that Cynthia is going to have forwarded out through David. We talked about the language we're adding to the BSRB website about LPCs and LCPCs. New business, we reviewed the draft survey for the report on LPCs and LCPCs. We talked about supervision manual, and then we talked, well, we didn't get to, but we decided we would talk next meeting about the rest of the work that we want to include for the year. Our next meeting will be June 5th. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have master's level psychology. The LMLP LCP advisory committee met on April 2nd. We too continued discussions on AI and adding a description of our professions to the BSRB website. We also took a look at the draft survey report from the LMLPs and LCPs. Our next meeting is scheduled for June 4th. Marriage and family.
Yes, thank you. Our advisory committee met in April 11th, and we discussed continued use of AI in the field and what we should be looking at in terms of regulation or monitoring of that. We also reviewed the draft survey for the MFT licensees, and we'll continue to look at that. And then we also discussed adding advisory members. We hope to continue to add a couple of advisory members each year. And our next meeting is June 13th.
Thank you. Addiction counseling.
Good morning, everyone. The Addiction Counseling Advisory Committee has not met since before the last board meeting. We plan to be reviewing survey results of addiction counselors in the state, and we'll continue conversations on AI and other things. We also have 5 advisory committee members, which we will get to in new business, that are seeking reappointment for a second, third, fourth term. And our next meeting is at 10 a.m. on Tuesday, June 3rd.
Thank you. Behavior analysis.
Yep, we met on April 18th and we talked about some of the legislative updates from this legislative term. And of course, we're all particularly interested in the recommendation that we add a member to the board from the behavior analyst community so that all the behavior analysts feel like they are adequately represented with a permanent board member. We spent a lot of time talking about that and how that process would work next year so we could move forward and try to make sure that we can get that in for the next legislative session. We talked about the terms and for membership on advisory committees. We were full at that particular point. We'll talk about it again in new business. But we have most of the members would like to be reappointed. There were 2 that declined though, and which I think is somewhat of a good thing because then it'll give us a staggered entrance onto the board instead of having everybody exit all at once and then having to re-educate people on how the whole process works. We did continue our discussion on artificial intelligence, but due to time, because we did spend a long time talking about the legislative process, that one was tabled. We also continued to talk about our description on the BSRB website. Once again, that was tabled. Our discussion on the survey findings for the behavior analysts was tabled as well as our what it means to be a behavior analyst. It's interesting because we have a community member in one of our more rural areas that are representing themselves as a behavior analyst, but they are not. And so, we spent some time talking about KSA 65-7503 and the authority that we as a board have over what I believe is somebody misrepresenting themselves professionally out in the field. And based on the language in that 65-7503, we don't have any jurisdiction to tell that person to cease and desist. And so in order to be able to do that, we would have to change the wording in that, which means we'd have to open that bill up. So I think we're going to continue to talk about that maybe at the meeting and what that means and, try to find somebody to spot. I don't know. We'll have to depend on David to be able to give us information on how that would potentially work. We were going to set the agenda for 2025, but once again, behavior analysts like to talk about things, and we didn't get to that either. So we will continue our discussion on our topics for this year. Excuse me. And I can tell I'm back in Kansas. Last year I was on vacation. I had 0 allergies, and here I am back in Kansas again. So our next meeting is Friday, June 13th at 1 o'clock via Zoom. And I would like to say, Cynthia, I would be really interested in that informed consent. So David, I would be really interested in getting that to the behavior analyst advisory committee. And that's it. Thanks.
Jim?
Just a question, for Linda, the behavioral analyst designation, is that not covered in the regulation as to who can use that title?
Nope.
And I assume, Tim, that's why we can't do anything about it, because in a past life, when someone used dental or dentist assistant, and whatnot, we were able to shut that down, but in this case, we have no footing.
Right. I don't think he's aware of it. He wasn't at that meeting, Jim.
Yeah, I would, notwithstanding, I would suggest a referral to the complaint review committee.
Oh,
I understand what you're saying, Linda, but I think that would be the prudent thing to do, at least refer it to the CRC so that, the facts and circumstances can be investigated.
thank you, Tim. Can we do that, David?
Yeah, anyone can submit a complaint, and so that is definitely something that could be pursued.
All right. Can I reach out to the person that inquired about it because they reached out to me first?
Yes.
Okay, so
would
I
just-
have the authority to reach out to that person and recommend that, or do I recommend to the committee that we refer to the CRC? What's that process?
Anyone who wants to submit a complaint just needs to submit a complaint in writing to the complaint review committee.
Okay.
And so I would have that person personally submit a complaint. And the way that the statute is written, they needs to be practicing, not representing.
All right, so they are currently employed as a behavior analyst and representing themselves on their website. And it's my understanding that some behavior analysts have reached out to them because that's the process for the behavior analyst certification board, is that you reach out to the person and let them know that what they're doing is not appropriate. And
I would just have that person submit a complaint to the behavioral sciences relative board in writing, and the complaint form is on the website.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's important as a member of the public that we, whether it's covered in regulation or not, I hate to think we can't do anything.
Yeah.
I'd like to see us explore doing something to at least keep the standard of care in the state to the public at a certain level.
Thank you, Jim. That's exactly what I felt. It was like, yeah.
And we investigate ones like that all the time.
Okay, thank you.
All right. We are now scheduled for a 10-minute break. So we will plan to be back at 11:22. Thank you.
Okay, we're back.
All right. Well, that takes us to old business on the agenda and a continued discussion on possible changes to regulations, starting with unprofessional conduct.
Okay, in your packet of material, which I would recommend that you use, you have a document that is about 21 pages. And this is a crosswalk of the language of the unprofessional conduct regulations for all 7 professions regulated by the BSRB. We have added an additional column to the far right with BSRB recommended language. And I want to thank one of my staff members, Misty. She did a lot of work to help put this together originally. And as you may remember, we had a draft of this for the last board meeting. She did a lot of good work cleaning this up. She also went ahead and put some thought into what the BSRB recommended language could be. And so there are many different items on this. There's not enough time for us to go through all these items today, but I thought if we could walk through this document together, just looking at about 10 items today, that would allow the board some conversation to decide if you would like to have standard language for some of these items across the professions, or if you would like for there to be some different language based on some of the uniquenesses of the professions. So I will go ahead and share the document and share my screen here. It's going to be a little difficult to see perhaps based on how big the document is. So we'll be starting on page 6 of that document that's titled Unprofessional Conduct Crosswalk with BSRB Recommendations from May 12th, 2025. And we can start with item number 20. So I will share my screen. If you raise your hand, I'm probably not going to be able to see it. So if you have comments or thoughts, please just go ahead and speak openly. But like I said, I will go ahead and share my screen here. And I will try to make this document as big as helpful. Okay. So I am sharing a copy of the crosswalk here. And as you can see on the left side of the document in the purple, there is some numbering. So at the beginning of each of the unprofessional conduct regulations, it does have some standard language that's not uniform between professions, but it does kind of say if an applicant or licensee commits any of the following acts, it would be unprofessional conduct. At some point, we should revisit that. And at some point, we can go through the remainder of the items on this list. But I thought for today, we could start with item 20 and then kind of look at the language across the professions and then see if you had any thoughts, if you would like to standardize that language or not. So we'll go ahead and take a look at item number 20 there.
And Dave, for reference, might we know which columns belong to which professions? I know it's at the very top.
Yes. Yes, so it's not a floating header just because this is a PDF version of this document, but basically the leftmost column, I believe it goes in alphabetical order. Yeah, almost alphabetical order. It goes addiction counseling, behavior analysis, licensed psychologist, master's level psychologist, and then marriage and family therapy, professional counseling, and then social work. And the furthest column on the right is just BSRB recommended language. So.
And what I did is I copied it and named it copy so I could have 2 copies open. And I just have the one with the headers at the top, just in case anybody else is interested in doing that.
Okay. It's a good idea. Okay, well, item number 20, if we could just kind of start with item 20 and then see what progress we make. Thought we can go from about 20 to item 30. Item 20 starts off, it deals with the topic of engaging in professional activities. Current language says including billing practices and advertising involving dishonesty, fraud, deceit, or misrepresentation. For the addiction counseling, they had some additional language they recommended adding, which said engaging in professional activities, including but not limited to, and then it listed billing practice, advertising involving dishonesty, fraud, deceit, or misrepresentations. The idea being that perhaps it wouldn't necessarily have to be limited to billing and advertising, but that those were maybe most prominent. As you look across, there is language which is pretty close for the behavior analyst profession. For the psychology profession, it is a little bit different. It says engaging in proprieties with respect to fees and billing statements, which shall include the following: exploiting clients or payers with respect to fees, misrepresenting one's fees, failing to inform a patient or client who fails to pay for services as agreed, that collection procedures may be implemented, including the possibility that a collection agency may be used for legal measures may be taken, and 4, filing claims for services that were not rendered. But for most of the other professions, the language is similar. A lot of the professions are recommended, including but not limited to, adding that language. So, any thoughts by board members if this is one where you would like to have somewhat standard language across professions? And if so, what kind of language you would like?
Seems like most of them are very similar, and I like the recommended language.
I agree.
I think that with respect to the psychologists, the way it's written right now is not as, even though it's longer, is not as comprehensive or as encompassing as the other professions. And I don't want to speak for members of the Licensed Psychology Advisory Committee. And I think that it would be appropriate if we were to adopt any one of the others professions language in substitution for what we have written. And I would certainly take comment from anyone about that.
The only thing I like about those, or the longer explanation, is it gives concrete examples. The other the language that all of the other columns have is broader and leaves it up to, I guess, the complaint review committee and maybe possibly the full board to determine whether a particular action fits under those headings. So it not having, and again, the examples that are given wouldn't be comprehensive. There would be lots more that could fall under that. So maybe that's fine to leave it broad, but it just strikes me that that's the only one that gives really concrete examples.
Yeah, I agree, Cynthia. And just a quick, I'll put my lawyer hat on and maybe ask Tim. It seems to me there's a comma in the recommended language that shouldn't be there after advertising. But to Cynthia's point, I like the idea of actually putting the included but not limited to more as a way of adding those examples at the end of the more broad statement. So instead it would read engaging in professional activities, including billing practices and advertising involving dishonesty, fraud, deceit, or misrepresentation, including but not limited to, and then that numbered list that's over in the psychology section.
Yeah, one thing that's currently maybe a little concerning about the items under the psychology list is it says engaging in improprieties with respect to fees and billing statements, which shall include the following items.
Yeah,
that's what I was going to say. The shall makes it, that is what it is.
Yep.
Yeah, and it's 1,
Right.
2.
But I wouldn't
Okay,
include that part. I would just take the examples
and move them over to the
and move them
standard
over
language.
as the non, as a list that's not all inclusive. It's more that they're examples.
Examples.
Okay.
The exploiting clients or payers with respect to fees is a little bit broad as well, though. That's not as concrete as misrepresenting one's fees, failing to inform, etc. So I don't know if that could be clarified or omitted.
You know, I'm going to go back to, I guess where I lean in a little bit is on less is more sometimes, and how we intend to do things, and how sort of like we come up with an intention of helping people explain things, and then people get sort of narrowly focused that this is the only thing that constitutes these things, even though we put the language. If there's an opportunity, and I think anytime you list things, you run the risk of, again, that sort of thought process that you're giving. What's an example where I'm thinking through some of the complaints we've received in this area, and I think, you know, the broader might be more helpful. And then this also talks about advertising, not just your fees and billing statement, but advertising. So I don't know if in the psychologist professional conduct centers, there's other places where that is the case, but things like the recommendation, I'm still in favor of the recommendation section here, but
Yeah, I
Jen,
think
are there any other, sorry, I was just going to say, are there any other places in our regulations where we use examples?
I think that for psychologists, there may be examples under matters related to psychological testing, but I'm not recalling any specific ones for psychologists.
If I can amend my grammar statement, I think actually the comma needs to come out after two.
yeah, I agree with that, David. Yeah.
That solves that solves the problem.
Yes.
You know, so in regard to the psychology reg, I would suggest that 2 and 4 would be covered by the suggested language. It's really a matter of, you know, 1 and 3. I agree with Cynthia's comment on 1. That's probably a broad and arguably vague standard. 3, I'm not sure that rises to the level of the standard. And so if that's something that psychology wants to keep, you know, I think that probably would be an item that's unique to psychology number 3.
I mean,
Because I don't think that failing to inform about collection procedures is necessarily, you know, arises to fraud or misrepresentation, unless you want to make it an affirmative standard.
Well, and Tim, wouldn't it be better to actually have the including but not limited to billing practices and advertising after, like, it seems to me that clause needs to come at the end. So you say engaging in professional activities involving dishonesty, fraud, deceit, or misrepresentation, including but not limited to billing practices and advertising. It just seems to me having them in the middle there is breaking up the intent of I mean, and here I'm keying off of what you were saying in terms of wanting to keep it broad instead of having examples.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, the way I read it was that billing practices and advertising are, you know, modifying or providing examples of professional activities, and that's the location. But I think you could do it either way.
Just a little input is that what has happened is that people think it's only limited to these things. Is that it can be anything on this list. It's professional practices, and it can be all of these things.
Which things?
Any of these things on this list.
Which things?
Engaging in professional practices, including but not limited to.
But not limited to.
All of these goodies.
Yeah, I think that would be a likely counter argument that you would receive, is that it's.
If you would look at,
examples,
just for simplification, the MFT language, because if we're in the professional conduct standards themselves, so we have to keep in mind that we're going to call out a lot of different unprofessional behavior. So I believe the intent of this section is really related to billing practices and advertising.
Mm-hmm.
So that in some ways, we're complicating it by saying, but not limited to, because we already have sections of the regulation standard that refer to unprofessional conduct. So my suggestion, now I'm going to pull back what I said, is maybe the simplification in the MFT language is clearer for this particular regulation. Unless we're going to list out things such as the psychologists do, and then it does need to be included, but not limited to. That would be my next recommendation.
Can I make a suggestion worded, which would be engaging in professional activities, and then you could do a hyphen, such as billing or advertising hyphen, that involve dishonesty, fraud, deceit, or misrepresentation.
I think the dishonesty, fraud, deceit, and misrepresentation is also referenced in other categories of unprofessional conduct that are listed as, I think as Mary said
before we
earlier.
change this, could people tell me where the misrepresentation and dishonesty is?
In
Just
what?
before we change this, because we use this one for misrepresentation. This is what we use for.
Cindy, are you asking, is
Yeah,
that
like
word in
in
any other
particular,
part?
Tim, this is the regulation that we use for someone misrepresentation.
But are
You're
you
asking if it's located somewhere else?
Yeah, this is
Right.
the regulation that we use to charge someone, or that we use when there's an allegation of misrepresentation. This is the one that we assigned it for misrepresentation.
of
Yeah,
any
I-
When
kind?
someone
Billing and
when
fees.
someone
And
does something dishonest, we very seldom have fraud, but this is what we use for when someone takes a credit card, when someone signs in late, when someone is dishonest. This is the regulation that we use.
So
And
dishonest in any way,
in any way.
not just about billing and advertising.
No, but we use it for both. And so if it is somewhere else that we have not been using it and we have been incorrect. But this is the one, we use it for
Cindy?
both.
Cindy, I looked in addiction counseling and that's the only place it says dishonest.
Mhm.
And so this would be the one coming back to the person representing themselves as a behavior analyst. This is the one that would apply.
We do not find it, and I am not clear on that, Linda.
Right, but I mean, if you looked at it, somebody advertising themselves as something that they're not.
That might be an interpretation of that, Linda.
Okay, thanks.
Well, if it's used that broadly, then the specific examples that are listed for psychology there are just a small area.
Yes.
I would just say, I would support including with it, but not limited to. Because it gives very specific examples.
probably too specific, because I think then for some of us, we wouldn't necessarily want all, like with Tim's comments earlier, I still am going back to the MFT language, because you're talking about billing and advertising involving dishonesty, fraud, deceit, or misrepresentation, which would include, Cindy, what you're talking about, which is misrepresenting who you are or your qualifications.
This is something that we use often. We use this regulation often. And so.
And if it's not listed anywhere else for psychologists, then I would certainly even lean in even more when it comes to substituting the language, or if we did a minor incorporation. But yeah, I would be in favor of either the change to be like the MFTs. I can see a case, Cindy, when it comes to having including but not limited to, that could be potentially important. But I agree with Mary and with what everybody is saying about how limiting the regulation reads for psychologists.
And Tim might agree. I don't know. Your regulation is just limiting because it says shall.
It's yes. So the shall then leads to the four points below, and that constrains the clause.
I would
So
agree.
it sounds,
We can do the including but not limited to.
Yeah, I
that
think
makes-
we need, we think we need that in there because otherwise, people would read it as fraud or dishonesty only related to billing or practices or advertising. I think we need to say including but not limited to, since this regulation is obviously being used in a very broad way
Mhm.
in what we're hearing.
Yeah,
And maybe that's just the way this is what we use because we have not found it somewhere else. And maybe that's just the way all the regulations are written.
no, it makes sense. I mean, it makes sense why we use it.
so on this last column, basically, if I'm hearing the discussions by the members of the board, it sounds like engaging in professional activities. There was some support for saying involving dishonesty, fraud, deceit, or misrepresentation. So taking that part of it and moving it up. So it's engaging in professional activities involving dishonesty, fraud, deceit, or misrepresentation. And if I'm including but not limited to billing practices and advertising. Correct.
Yeah.
Yes, and actually, if you removed your comma after activities, it does the same thing, I think.
Okay.
But that would be my interpretation.
Okay. Okay, and most of the professions have language that's pretty similar to that. I guess before we move on to the next item, are there any board members from the professions that feel like they should have some different language based on their profession? I don't see any opposition, so it looks like we can have maybe some standard language on this one. So that would be nice. Okay. Well, let's go to the next item. The next item is item number 21. And that item says it would be unprofessional conduct for practitioner to be using alcohol of any illegal drug or misusing any substance that could cause impairment while performing the duties or services of an addiction counselor. And a lot of them just say preparing or performing X profession. So I wouldn't concern yourself so much about the unique language per profession when it comes to that. I would focus more about the language before that says using alcohol or any illegal drug or misusing any substance that could cause impairment while performing the duties of, etc.
I think the problem with the recommendation is that you're saying that impairs professional judgment. By very nature, if you're intoxicated under the influence at a place of employment, I'm thinking of some recent complaints, that is impaired judgment. But I think the case could be made when you use the word impaired judgment, is that a legal definition of like an intoxication level? So again, I think if we go back to the intent of this standard, just looking at the MFT language, which is a little more simple than some of the others, is using alcohol or illegally using any controlled substance that while performing duties or services. So just some things that in my mind, we probably need to think about in that statement.
Yeah, I think on the suggested language, you have to focus in on what you're going to have to prove.
Yeah.
And so you're going to have to prove that somebody's under the influence, and that it's impaired their judgment.
Yeah.
You're likely not going to have a situation where someone is called out and then they submit to, a blood or other test that could establish that they're in fact under the influence. But I would say that the issue, and I agree with the perspective here, because the issue that I think we've seen is that, the current standard is you're using it while performing services. You're likely not going to see somebody drinking while they're conducting a therapy session. It's going to happen prior to if they're doing it, and then they're going to be under the influence while they're doing it. And I think that's a good perspective. It's maybe just tweaking the language to, be careful about the proof the board ultimately would have. I would say we've had a case that involved something like this, and that was an allegation that was included, and it ultimately came down to proof. We resolved it, but that's the tough thing, I think, with this type of a regulation is proving it.
Yeah, with alcohol, even if somebody complained the next day after a therapy session, for example, and even if the therapist was willing to have a blood test or whatever, it's not going to show up. You have to prove that they were using it while they were performing the duties of a licensee, which means you have to be able to prove in that moment, which I don't know how you do that, because there's not going to be a complaint and an investigation until long after that. How have you dealt with those? Have you had those? How have you tried to prove whether somebody was under the influence during the performance of their duties?
Yeah, the situation that comes to mind, there was a complaint by a landlord. The person was renting an office from. There was a police report. There was pictorial evidence of, the substances which were being used. But we had a gap as far as proving that they actually had used prior to performing therapy. It was a case we resolved, but that's the disconnect. And so I think you need pretty good evidence to establish it. But I mean, I think the policy, the perspective is good. Maybe just tweaking the language so that, the proof can be most advantageous to the board is what we do here.
Well, and the language of the current regulations only refers to using alcohol or illegally using any controlled substance. The proposed change by one of the professions was talking about being under the influence, but that language doesn't currently, I don't think it currently exists in any of the regulations. So,
Thank you for saying that.
so Mary had talked about having some standard language similar to the item currently for marriage and family therapy. What would the board think about that language that says using alcohol or illegally using any controlled substance while performing the duties or services of a ex-practitioner?
The only thing that I might augment in that would be, so using alcohol or illegally, and maybe including or inappropriately, because if there are, say there's a psychologist who is on a pain medication, they're on an opioid-based pain medication, and it is, say it were appropriate for that person to be engaging in the use of it, but if it's the case that that person engaged in inappropriate use of it, so they're taking too much of it, that would be the inappropriate use of it. And we could say there's a hypothetical where there's a chance that the person could be using it appropriately. And that's the only thing that I have about controlled substances.
Looking more like the addiction counsel regulation in column 1. Is that what you're suggesting, Richard?
That could cause impairment.
Yes.
And that's the standard language that's there. And I think that's the reason we even would have this regulation is because substances can impair judgment. So if you use the language that's suggested of being under the influence of any substance that impairs professional judgment, that covers even, using inappropriately a substance that you've been prescribed, like you just described, Rick.
Agreed.
Even if you use it appropriately, some people may have a, I very easily, medicine very much affects me. Someone else, it may not affect their judgment, but it would affect mine.
Right.
Yeah, that's the point that you're really looking for, them, whether or not they're impaired.
Impaired, right.
But it's back to how do you judge?
So I heard incorporating misusing any substance in the language, and then also that could cause impairment or could cause or impairs professional judgment. So,
well, I think being under the influence of any substance that impairs your judgment, or covers misuse, doesn't it?
Not necessarily.
If we focus on the use versus being under the influence, I prefer being under the influence. I don't know that we'll necessarily be able to prove when somebody used it or that they were stepping out of the room to use while they're performing services. I like the being under the influence standard.
The problem is proving that impairs professional judgment, because with the examples we've been discussing, someone could be taking an appropriate amount of pain medication that doesn't impair them.
And what about could cause?
Yeah, that
That's
may
kind of
impair or could impair.
Would impair.
Well,
Yeah,
but then that means if you're taking, if if there's a potential that pain medicine could impair your professional judgment, then you're committing unprofessional conduct if you take it. If we word it as if it may impair your judgment.
Well, there is the language for addiction counseling that talks about misusing. So you have alcohol covered, you have any
Okay.
illegal drug, or misusing any substance that could cause impairment. So that way you don't really get into needing to prove impairment. It's more about like what Tim said in terms of the use.
Okay.
And then you have those three things that are listed. So any board members have any issue with having language similar to what the addiction counselors have in that first column?
Tim said he thought it would be better to be under the influence instead of using.
Could cause. Said it could cause.
Okay.
Or that could cause impairment.
So it would say being under the influence of alcohol or any illegal drug or misusing any substance. That's what we would change. Is that what I heard?
That could cause impairment.
That worries me a little bit, just because a lot of medications could cause impairment, but that doesn't mean they are causing impairment if they're being used appropriately under a doctor's supervision, etc.
We're
But
talking
if you
about
are under the
striking that.
influence,
Right.
yeah.
But again, with the pain medicine example, you may be under the influence of the pain medicine and it's doing its job and you're
That
able to
doesn't mean
function
you're
and have,
impaired.
and you're not impaired, but it could cause impairment. So I'm just thinking of ways that it could be twisted
Yeah,
against
I
a
think that's a
practitioner.
good perspective. I think what I would say there is that, if you look at the addiction counselor language, it wouldn't be illegal in that situation. And if you're following a lawful prescription, you wouldn't be misusing. I think that's likely the way that you would reconcile.
That's a good point.
So 30-minute comment.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know we're having really good discussion about these items. There's quite a few. I am curious to ensure that we continue to move through these. I'm wondering if it would be helpful if there was maybe a subcommittee. Our board members, when we talked about these in the advisory committees, but just to make sure we have some good consensus, bringing these back to the board to move forward. What would your preference be as board members? Would you like to have sort of a subset of the board look at these and kind of try to reach some likely consensus on language, or would you like us just to continue to work through these at board meetings? Or
What's the time frame?
so there's no real set time frame on these. Some of these have not been updated in 20 years. So when we're ready to submit them, we can submit them to the process, but a lot of them, it's been a long time. So whenever we have the right language, we can move forward, but there's no set standard.
Just wonder if we did a subcommittee, if ultimately we'd end up doing this exact same thing where
Anyway, right?
everyone has an opinion and a perspective from their profession. So if there's a way for us to just dedicate X amount, like we have to get through X each meeting, I think everyone will want to have input.
I agree.
I agree.
Okay, well, I'll prep you for the next board meeting. There's some topics that I want you to give some thought to. On 22, some of these regulations combine the topics of dual relationships and undue influence. And I would recommend perhaps splitting those two things out. Some of them have it as separate regulations, some have it as one. So whatever language, I would recommend that gets split out. There's also some items in 23 and 24 that talk about making sexual advances towards either someone who's been a client or someone who's been a client within the last few years, or a supervisee or potentially a student. So give some thought to that one, because I imagine that would be one that the board will want to have some good conversation about. And then you can take a look at the remaining items, but I think if we can try to focus on getting through the 20 through 30. Now that we have this document kind of put together, maybe just review some of that language and we can talk about it at the next board meeting.
How would you do that?
And maybe
I just
we'll
want
have-
to, I just wanted to say this is really useful, and I really appreciate the work that went into putting this together for us.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, thank you, Cynthia and Richard, and maybe we'll ask Tim to give a review of some of this language too. I definitely want to hear his thoughts, and I think his analysis of these meetings is really helpful too. He did bring a unique perspective, being board legal counsel, so but maybe we'll try to work with Tim outside of this and bring back maybe some of that tweaked language for the BSRB recommendation with some Tim's input as well.
Very good. That takes us to expedited application review process.
And I apologize with the different items that have been moving and the different mid-year meetings. This is an item that I don't want us to forget about, but it'll have to be tabled for one more meeting. Hopefully, should have some good information for you at the next meeting in July.
Very good. Thank you. So we move on to new business and the reappointment of advisory committee members.
And as we talked about, advisory committee members serve 2-year terms. Currently, they can serve up to 4 terms before they would need to come off the advisory committee. And so individuals who are listed here have remaining eligibility on their current advisory committee and have expressed a desire to be reappointed by the board. This list was sent out. I went ahead and sent the list of individuals seeking reappointment to the chair of the advisory committee and also the chair of the board. So if there are any concerns, those could be discussed. And so those are the individuals you see on the list, are the individuals who are seeking reappointment for another 2-year term.
And no one's raised any concerns about these?
No, there's no concerns right now.
Okay.
And so if you wanted to reappoint them to the advisory committees, you could just basically say you're reappointing the following members to the advisory committees, and you can just read them off.
Okay. So I'll reappoint to the Addiction Counseling Advisory Committee, Lisa Carter, Chad Jacobs, Mike James, Charity Cosin, and Zenova Williams. I'll reappoint to the Behavior Analyst Advisory Committee, Allison Bell, Kelly Harrison, Emily Kessler, Pamela Neidert, Stephanie Wiley, and Alice Young. To the Marriage and Family Therapy Advisory Committee, reappoint Heidi Bella. To the Master's Level Psychology Advisory Committee, Rebecca Jabara, Ruth Johnson, Lauren Luck, Robert Pedroza, and Jennifer Schreiner. Reappointing to the Psychology Advisory Committee, Mark Goodman, Matthew Golker, Jessica Hamilton, Edward Hunter, Tiffany Johnson, and Jay Middleton. And reappointing to the Social Work Advisory Committee, Mary Gill and Eric Denneker. For anybody's name I butchered, I apologize for that. That takes us to a review and discussion of draft survey reports of licensees.
Okay, thank you, Dave. And before we get into that report, which you do have in your packet, it's about a 60-page document. We thought we'd go ahead and put this as a presentation today to show you a comparative report. But I do want to say, just before we get to that, the advisory committee members do an excellent job, and I think that's one of our strengths. People sometimes ask me how in the world, You do all these different things for 7 professions when there's some that are independent professions at some of the associations. And I think we could not do the work that we do as a board without the advisory committees. And we have 50 to 60 people that volunteer their time for those 2-hour meetings. Their comments and input are very, very valuable. So really happy that so many individuals wanted to seek reappointment. And whenever people ask, how things work here, I always share that that's a way that we can have good conversations for each of the professions while the board is still able to act together as one board. So want to recognize them and thank them again for their service. For the presentation here, I will go ahead and start a PowerPoint presentation. I will go ahead and pull up a PDF of this document. So basically, we talked earlier that we did a survey for 6 of the professions, and that is because we've done surveys for the social work profession in the past and had a lot of success reaching out to social workers and getting input on a lot of different topics. And so we decided to work with the advisory committees and put together different things, surveys for all the other professions. And so you should see here a draft comparison report on survey of licensees, part 1. We'll go ahead and do this at least in 2 parts. So today we'll talk about some of the questions on the surveys that had some measure of standardization. Some of these are not identical, and we'll point that out. But a lot of these questions we were able to ask across professions. And we'll go into a little bit of the work that was done on the surveys, but I also have 2 other staff members who are sitting in on the board meeting for this part, and they were very, very instrumental in helping us prepare those draft survey reports for the survey results. Emma and Tyler, feel free to add comments as we go through this and share your thoughts. And you did a lot of really good work analyzing some of the responses. So this will focus on primarily some of the multiple choice type questions for the survey. And then in part 2, we'll talk a little bit more about the analysis of the open field responses. But we'll go ahead and jump into this. And for those of you who are on Zoom, I just want to make sure you can see the report that says draft comparison report on survey of licensees.
Yes.
Are you all in? Okay, great. Well, just a little bit about the survey. So following previous surveys of social workers in 2021 and 2024, with the assistance of the advisory committees, the BSRB designed surveys of licensees in 6 other professions regulated by the board. The survey questions focused on topics relevant to the public protection work of the board and to better understand the workforce in Kansas. While the survey included a few unique questions per profession, efforts were made to create uniformity for most topics between the professions. So both a profession-specific report and an overall summary report comparing professions could be created. Licensees were informed that the survey was optional, though they were encouraged to participate. It would be administered through surveymonkey.com, and their responses would be anonymous. And also that a report summarizing the results of the survey would be posted on the BSRB website at bsrb.ks.gov. Just some high-level comments about the draft survey reports that we've gone through with the advisory committee so far. Draft survey reports were presented to the BSRB by the BSRB executive director to the advisory committees, which met in April of 2025. These draft reports are currently available on the BSRB website under the materials for the following meetings. Professional counseling met on April 1st, 2025. And just to give you some context into these individual draft reports, this is how many pages these reports are. So the professional counseling one is 113 pages. Master's level psychology met on April 2nd. Their report was 75 pages. Marriage and family therapy, we met on April 11th. Their report was 77 pages. Behavior analysis, April 18th. Their report is 56 pages. And licensed psychology met on April 29th. And their report is 59 pages. As we talked about before, addiction counseling meets quarterly. So they have not had a meeting since the last board meeting. We'll be presenting information on June 3rd to their advisory committee as well. And I don't want you to be too intimidated by the page numbers of these reports. It's all good information, but we did things a little bit different with these comparison reports and these summary reports. So what we decided to do is the first 15 pages or so of the report really focuses on analytical descriptions and summary information for a lot of these questions. And then we wanted to preserve the voice of the individuals who answered these surveys. So there are appendices that follow those summary reports, and all the appendices include the responses. So we really do encourage each member of the advisory committee to go through all the language in those appendices. But if anybody is interested in reading these draft reports, feel free to do so. They're all posted on the BSRB website under materials for each of these meetings. In terms of the survey response rates, the response rates for the survey for psychologists, there were 297 licensees who completed the survey for a response rate of 28.4%. For marriage and family therapy across the profession, the response rate overall was 296 licensees. That was a response rate of about 25%. For the LMFTs, there were 69 individuals who completed the survey for a 22.6 response rate. And for LCMFTs, 227 licensees for a response rate of nearly 26%. Master's level psychology overall, 236 licensees for a response rate of 37.7%. LMLPs, 113 licensees for a response rate of 32%. Clinical level, master's level, 123 licensees for a response rate of 44.9%, which was a very good response rate for the clinical level for the master's level psychology profession. Professional counseling overall, 716 licensees completed the survey for 26.6%. The LPCs, 274 individuals completed the survey for 22.7%. LCPCs, 442 licensees completed the survey for 29.7% response rate. Behavior analyst overall, 71 licensees completed the survey for about 14% response rate. For the assistant behavior analyst, 3 licensees completed the survey for 16.7%. For behavior analyst, 68 licensees completed the survey for a 13.9%. And then, as we mentioned before, the addiction counseling results we made available after the draft report as we presented to the Addiction Counseling Advisory Committee on June 3rd, 2025. The reason I'm stressing all these response rates is because each one of these numbers represents an individual who took the time to do the report. And I think if you look through those reports, you will really see people were generous with their time and thoughtful with their answers. And so I think there's a lot of good information the board can get from these reports. Now we'll go into some of the questions that had some uniformity between them. And first one that we looked at was, do you practice in a predominantly urban area, rural area, or frontier area? And for psychology, I'll try to make the slide here a little bit bigger. For psychology, the #1 response was urban area, and it was very pronounced. The response rate for that was 85.8% in an urban area, and rural area, it was about 13.5%. Compared to marriage and family therapy, while urban area was the highest for both LMFTs and LCMFTs, the number was lower. For LCMFTs, it was about 74%, urban areas about 21%, whereas LMFTs was about 69% and about 20% for rural areas. For the master's level profession, the number was even lower in terms of the difference between urban and rural. In terms of the clinical level, the LCPs, 56% provided services predominantly in an urban area, but 35% provided services in a rural area. And one of the interesting things for the LMLPs is that it was almost evenly split between urban and rural. Urban area was about 46%, whereas rural was about 44%. For the professional counseling, you have a greater split, kind of like you have seen with some of the professions. More individuals provided services in an urban area for the LCPCs. The urban area was about 72.3%, rural right around 20%. LPCs, urban area about 65%, rural area about 24%. And then for the behavior analysts, for the assistant behavior analyst, a very small sample size, of course, but 2 of the 3 practice in an urban area, 1 in a rural. And then for the behavior analysts, most common answer was an urban area, at about 56%, though rural was higher than some of the other professions in the 30s there. We asked individuals, do you primarily work in a public practice, private practice, educational setting, or another setting? For psychology, about 54% noted they worked in private practice, with about 22 or 23% noting they work in a public practice. And then one of the other common factors you'll see here is about 10 to 15% of most professions are practicing in the area of education. And then for this grouping, there was also over 10% of the individuals who practice in another not mentioned area. For marriage and family therapy, is much more pronounced. High number of individuals are working in private practice. For the LCMFTs, about 79% are working in private practice. For the LMFTs, about 75%. So a little bit lower, but still pronounced as far as that profession. And then for all other categories, public, education, and other, all of those were all under 10%. For master's level psychology, for the clinical level, the licensed clinical psychotherapist, the most common number or most common response was private practice, but it was under 50%. Just about 44% of respondents marked private. About 35% marked public, and then about 14% marked other. For the master's level psychologists, the LMLPs, it was very close between public and private, about 36 and 35% accordingly. And then the other category was about 20 or 21%. This was not an open field response, so there wasn't an option for people to tell us what they were marking when they selected other, but I thought it was kind of notable. For the professional counseling profession, for the clinical level of professional counselors, about 2/3 or 68, 69% work in private practice. Only about 16% work in public practice. But for the LPCs, it is much closer in terms of the ratio. Just about 49% work in private practice and about 30% work in public practice. And then over 10% work in education, but it's just a little over 10%. And then about another 10% work in that other category. For the behavior analyst profession, all three individuals who completed the survey noted for the assistant behavior analyst, they work in private practice. For the behavior analyst, private practice was the most common response, but it wasn't the majority. It was 41.2%. And even almost even number noted they work in public practice or education. It was the highest number for education for the behavior analyst profession at 22%. The next question that we asked practitioners, how many years have you practiced in that profession? And if applicable, you may include years practicing in other states. So for the psychologist, the most common response by far was for individuals who had practiced, and I'll try to make this just a little bit bigger. Most common response for psychologists was individuals who practiced for over 10 years, and that was about 81%. The next highest was about 11%, and it was individual psychologists who worked between 5 to 10 years, and then every other answer was around 5% or lower. For the marriage and family therapy profession, the clinical level of marriage and family therapist, the highest number was still over 10 years, but it was a closer ratio. So about 67% of clinical marriage and family therapists had done marriage and family therapy for over 10 years. About 27% noted they practiced between 5 to 10 years. And then fewer years were about 5% or lower. For the non-clinical marriage and family therapist, over 10 years was tied for the most common response at 27.5% with 2 to 5 years. And then also 1 to 2 years was close at 23.2%. About 13% had between 5 and 10 years. So now you may expect some of these numbers to look like this because for some individuals, They may have received their LMFT license and they're working to accrue the 3,000 hours over 2 years to become a clinical licensee. I thought it was interesting to see for the levels that do have tiered licensure, some of these comparison comparable numbers. For the master's level profession, for the clinical level, the number of individuals that are practicing over 10 years, that was by far the highest grouping, 85.4%. The next highest was about 10% with 5 to 10 years. For the master's level psychologist, over 10 years was the highest level, but it was much more slanted at 42.9%. 5 to 10 years was about 25%, 2 to 5 years about 21%, and then lower numbers accordingly. For the professional counseling profession, for clinical level practitioners, the number over 10 years was the highest, but it was lower than some of the other professions. It was at 69%. There's a fair number of individuals who are working between 5 to 10 years, and then maybe a higher than normal number between 2 to 5 years. For the LPCs, the response was interesting. The highest number there was between 2 to 5 years, and that was 32%. And then the next most common answers, well, there's really 3 that are very close, between 1 to 2 years, 5 to 10 years, and over 10 years. And you may be wondering why some of these are so high for the 5 to 10 years and over 10 years. There are questions on the open answer questions where we did allow individuals to ask, are you working towards a clinical level license? And if you're not, why not? And so I think some of the information that corresponds to these answers, you can find when we do the comparison of that information. And then for the behavior analyst profession, for the assistant behavior analyst, you had a sampling where one was between 2 to 5 years, one was 5 to 10 years, and one was over 10 years. And for the behavior analyst, the most common answer was over 10 years, but I think it might have been one of the smallest groupings. Behavior analysts tend to be sort of a younger profession. It's the most recent profession that we have started licensing. And we started issuing licenses back in 2016. So it is interesting to see that only 50% have practiced over 10 years, 5 to 10 years, 30%, and then 2 to 5 years, 13%. The next question asked, including Kansas, and how many states are you licensed as a psychologist or a marriage and family therapist or professional counselor? So we were trying to find out how many individuals or what proportions are licensed in multiple states. For psychologists, the most common answer was 1 state at 53%. And then 2 states made up a fair amount as well, 34%, and then the number significantly dropped. So 8.5% had between 3 to 5 licenses in different states, but the vast majority, over close to 90%, were either licensed in 1 state, which would be Kansas, or 2 states. For the marriage and family therapy, that is not a profession that has a multi-state compact currently, but the majority of the clinical marriage and family therapists, in fact, 69%, are only licensed in 1 state. There's about a quarter who noted they are licensed in 2 states. And then after that, the numbers drop significantly. Only about 6.3 are licensed between 3 to 5 states. And one other person preferred not to answer. For the LMFTs, that number is more pronounced. 86% are licensed in 1 state. 9.2% are licensed in 2 states. And then all the rest were very small percentages. For master's level, very pronounced. 96% were licensed in 1 state for the clinical level, and 96% were licensed in 1 state for the master's level. For professional counseling, it is a bit more split. 45.9% noted they were licensed in 1 state. However, 35.5% noted they are licensed in 2 states, and I believe the highest amount for 3 to 5 states, 14.5%, is in the counseling profession. So it'll be interesting to see how the counseling numbers do change after that compact becomes operational. For the LPCs, a lot of states do not have 2 levels of permanent licensure below the clinical level. So it's not that surprising to me that for our LPCs, they would be licensed in one state and that would just be Kansas, but about 10% were licensed in 2 states.
Just a clarification question. So when they have a contract, does that equate to being licensed in other states? Just as a kind of literal reading of the language?
So for all the compacts are different, but for the professional counseling compact, it would require you to hold a home state license. So you'd have to have a license at least in one state where you live, most likely. And then aside from that, you could apply to the compact for a privilege to practice in different states.
So our question might need to reflect that kind of moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, that part of this was looking at, is this going to replace traditional licensure, or is it going to expand the number of states where someone is practicing? So right now, since the compact is not operational, licensure, or if they were to call it something different in a state, is really the only way to practice in multiple states. But for the compact, once it goes and becomes operational with these privileges to practice, they would be an alternative to licensure. You could still pursue traditional licensure, and some may. I'm sure there's some issues to be worked out in regards to reimbursements and things like that. But I think if we were to ask this question in the future and compare it, I think we would say, in how many states are you authorized to practice, either through licensure or a compact privilege or otherwise. And so right now we can ask about licensing, but I think in the future we might ask about authorization to practice. And then for the behavior analysts, I found it interesting. So 2 other assistant behavior analysts answered this question. They are only licensed to practice in Kansas. For the behavior analysts, an even split. So 41% said they were licensed in 1 state, 41% said they were licensed in 2 states, and then about 11% are licensed between 3 to 5 states. And not all states have licensure for behavior analysts. And so this will be interesting to see as this profession grows, if there is support from a national level in terms of the associations, maybe obtaining some funding to start a compact for behavior analysts potentially. Next question that was asked, in a typical week, how many hours do you provide in-person services to clients? We're trying to get a better understanding of the work people are doing in regards to in-person services. And I'll just tell you the questions that follow talk about how many hours per week do you deal with telehealth or remote services, and then how many hours per week do you oversee or supervise the work of others. So we're trying to get a snapshot, and this is not comprehensive, and it isn't defined. We didn't define what in-person services consist of, so it was open to interpretation. But we were asking people, how many hours per week do you provide in-person services to clients? For psychologists, the highest number here was about 40% said between 20 hours and 40 hours per week. And then the second was between 10 and 20 hours at about 22%. What was interesting to me is that about over 20% said that any given week they provide less than 5 hours of in-person services to clients. Now, I know some of those individuals work in education, and so they may look at things differently. Some individuals also marked in some of the open field answers that perhaps they keep their license active so they can provide supervision, but they're not necessarily seeing clients themselves. So could be something interesting for further examination. For marriage and family therapy, the highest number in terms of in-person services to clients was between 20 and 40 hours. That was 39%. The next most common answer was between 10 to 20 hours, 34%. And like we said, we didn't define this term for them. It's possible they could have considered paperwork or other documentation not part of providing in-person services, but those are the common answers that we received. Between 20 and 40% or between 10 and 20%. And then less most common is between 5 to 10 or between less than 5. For the LMFTs, the most common answer here was between 10 to 20 hours, and that was at 46%. And then the second most common at 19% was about 20 to 40 hours. And then 5 to 10 at 14%, and then less than 5 at about 11%. For the master's level psychology profession, most common answer here was between 20 to 40 hours at about 40%. And then the second most common for the clinical psychotherapist was less than 5 hours at 28%. And then third, significantly lower, about 16.7% was between 10 to 20 hours. And then almost 8% or 9% at 5 to 10 hours. For master's level psychologists, about 40% at the 20 to 40 hour per week, 23% between 10 and 20 hours, and then less than 5 still was about 20% of LMLPs, and then about 11% for between 5 and 10 hours. For the professional counseling profession, for the clinical level of licensees in that profession, 33% between 20 to 40 hours per week. So that was one of the smallest groupings for between 20 and 40. However, it's not too much further distant from the 10 to 20 hours, 28%. And then about 22% for the less than 5 hours, and about 10% from 5 to 10. For LPCs, about 36% between 20 hours and 40 hours. And then between 5 to 10 hours was the second most common at 23.2. About 20% less than 5 hours, and unsure why, but 10 hours to 20 hours was very low for this grouping at under 10%, just right around 8.2%. For the behavior analyst, the assistant behavior analyst, 1 marked less than 5 hours, 2 marked between 20 to 40 hours. For the behavior analyst, the most common answer was 20 to 40 hours at 35%. But the second most common was 25%, and then even split between 5 to 10 hours and 10 to 20 hours. Looking at telehealth and
Quick question, do we know how many hours they're working a week? Like are some of these I assume are part-time, which may explain some of the lower.
and that could be. We didn't ask them if they are working 40 hours per week, working part-time.
Gotcha.
We talked about in-person services. We were wanting to see the prevalence of telehealth and remote services clients. And so the next question was asking how many hours per week we provide telehealth or remote services. For psychologists, 57% said they provide less than 5 hours per week, but about almost 20% said between 5 and 10 hours. And then about 17% said between 10 hours and 20 hours. For marriage and family therapy, less than 5 hours was the most common response at 59%, but there was a much higher number of people providing between 5 to 10 hours, about 29%. And then for the LMFTs, 66% said they provide less than 5 hours of remote services per week, but about 22% said they provide between 5 to 10 hours per week. For the master's level, for the clinical practitioners, less than 5 hours per week was the most common answer at 71%. 5 to 10 hours was between 17% of respondents. And then for the master's level psychologists, 62% said they provide less than 5 hours, and about 21% said they provide between 5 and 10 hours per week. For the professional counselors, 47%, so less than half, noted less than 5 hours. About 22% said they provide between 5 to 10 hours. But now you start to see some of the practitioners that are providing some of the additional levels of higher level remote services. So their number between 10 and 20% was the highest we've seen so far at around 15%. And then even 12% said they practice between 20 hours and 40 hours of remote services. So some of those individuals, that may be the only type of practice they're doing currently, and they might be doing that full time. For LPCs, you'll see similar results to what you saw for the other professions. 72% said they do less than 5 hours per week, but about 14.8% said they do between 5 and 10 hours per week. The behavior analyst, 2 of the 3 said less than 5 hours. 1 said between 20 and 40 hours of remote services per week. And then for the behavior analyst, the most common answer was 63% for less than 5 hours, 20% between 5 and 10 hours, and then fewer as you move along. And then in a typical week, we asked how many hours are you responsible for supervising, managing, or overseeing the work of others? For psychology, about 2/3 said they do that less than 5 hours of their traditional work week. 15% said it constitutes between 5 to 10 hours, and then you see the other totals listed there. We only asked this of the highest level license for the professions. So we asked this the clinical marriage and family therapist. About 63% said they do this less than 5 hours, but about nearly 10% said between 5 and 10 hours, and then there's other totals accordingly. We did see on some individuals this prefer not to answer, was marked as prefer not to answer, and that's possible that they just did not wish to answer this question. It's also possible that they did that to indicate they don't provide supervision, and so as opposed to marking less than 5 hours. For the master's level psychology clinical practitioners, 65% noted that they provide supervision or oversee the work of others less than 5 hours per week. But about 10% said they spend between 20 to 40 hours per week in that capacity. And about 9% noted they spend over 40 hours per week overseeing or supervising the work of other people. For professional counselors, about 66% less than 5 hours of their week supervising or providing overseeing the work of others, and then the other numbers they report. Behavior analyst. This question was a little bit different given some of the uniqueness of that profession. So the question we asked for the behavior analyst was, in a typical week, how many hours of services implemented by BCA, BAs, or RBTs are you responsible for overseeing or managing? So the numbers did vary, and I included this question because it was in a similar order to the others, but given some of the differences, it probably is not a direct comparison across. But for this question, the most common answer was less than 5 hours. So there were higher totals for between 20 to 40 hours and over 40 hours, but also given the different wording of this question and the different interpretation, some individuals could have been taking it as a calculation based on the total number of hours for each of these individuals they're providing services or overseeing what those people are doing. Moving next, we are continuing to collect workforce information. So we asked, do you anticipate retiring from the profession in the next 5 years? And so for the psychology profession, about 2/3 or 68% said they do not anticipate retiring in the next 5 years, but about 18% said yes, and about 13% said they were unsure. And so 5 years is a long time, but if the individuals who marked yes and the individuals who marked unsure all happen to be yes, that could mean that about potentially 30% of psychologists could be retiring in the next 5 years. For marriage and family therapy, we asked both groups, do you anticipate retiring from the marriage and family therapy profession in the next 5 years? For the clinical level, 73.5% said no, 12% said yes, and about 13% were unsure. For the LMFTs, 85% said no, 11.8% said unsure, and only about 2.9% said yes. For the master's level psychologists, no was about 67%, yes was about 19%, and unsure was about 13%. For the non-clinical master's level practitioners, no was about 86%, unsure about 8.9%, and yes only about 4.5%. And I think it's reasonable to expect the non-clinical level to be a higher no, because some of these individuals are likely pursuing their years of clinical practice to get an independent level license. So they may be earlier in their careers. In terms of the professional counselor profession, no was about 77%. It's about 10% in both the yes column and 12% in the unsure. For LPCs, 84% said no, with both responses for yes and unsure right around 6%. And then for the behavior analysts, the 3 assistant behavior analysts said no. For most of the behavior analysts, 84%, they said they did not expect to retire, although 10% were unsure and about 4.4% said yes. We asked each of the professions how familiar are they with the work of the advisory committees. And as you might anticipate, there was some level of familiarity, but most of the individuals who responded to this survey question, and this is across the professions, were not very familiar with the advisory committee. So about 64% said they were not familiar, 22 somewhat familiar as far as a psychologist. For the marriage and family therapy, roughly similar numbers, about 60% not familiar and close to 20% is somewhat familiar. For master's level psychology, about 47% said they were not familiar, but a higher level showed some familiarity. For the LMLPs, not very familiar, about 20% somewhat familiar. For the professional counseling profession, the majority were not familiar, smaller grouping were somewhat familiar, same with the LPCs. And then behavior analyst, additionally, the number 1 answer was not familiar. Number 2 answer was somewhat familiar. And part of the reason we listed this question on the survey is to spotlight the work of the advisory committee. So we understood, based on the work practitioners are doing, they may not have very much interaction with the advisory committee, but this was our opportunity to make sure they were aware of the advisory committee, let them know the advisory committee meetings are broadcast on YouTube every other month. And some individuals did thank us for just asking this question because they said, well, I'm not familiar with the work of the advisory committee. I didn't realize they were meeting and that it was accessible by being on YouTube. So they said they will make it more of a point to become familiar with the work of the advisory committees. And then just the last question we're going to spotlight for you today in this comparison report. How many individuals do you currently provide supervision to? Unfortunately, we neglected to include a 0 response. So a lot of individuals marked prefer not to answer on this rather than 0. But for those who do provide supervision, 23.3% marked that they provide supervision to 1 person, a smaller number to 2, and then about 15% said between 3 to 5. Part of the reason we asked this question, there's been some other states that have expressed concern of individuals providing supervision to too many people. And so here you can see the most common answers are between 1 and 2. So it tends to be a smaller grouping of individuals, although there are a small number that are providing supervision to more than 10 people. For clinical marriage and family therapy, most of the individuals responded in the open field answers, they're not providing supervision. But for those that do, most common responses are 1, or at least between 3 to 5. When you start getting to the higher numbers, it becomes a very small number of practitioners who are providing that much supervision. For master's level psychology, additionally, for those providing supervision, most common answer is 1. In the vast majority, it's no more than 5. For professional counseling, you find the same results. And so I thought that was helpful information for you to see. Just as a note about going forward in the next part of this comparison report. So this will be continued into a part 2, including analysis of open field responses on topics. Some of the topics that we did ask about in the survey that I think you'll find interesting are whether licensees are maintaining an active license but are no longer working on these professions. Whether licensees below the clinical level of license are taking steps to obtain a clinical level license, and if they're not, why not? Interest in possible future multi-state compacts. Areas where licensees have observed other practitioners needing more training or education. Utilization of artificial intelligence. Issues concerning telehealth or remote practice. Negative issues concerning supervision. Recommendations on ways the BSRB could better protect the public, and then other topics. So there's a lot of great information in this survey. We wanted to spotlight some of this comparable information today, and feel free to peruse the information. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to me directly. But between now and the next meeting, I would encourage you to go to some of those pages for the draft survey reports and take a look at some of those reports. We did provide some summary information of the open field responses. We also provided the appendices, and like I said, people gave very thoughtful answers, and so. But before I go ahead and open up for questions, as I mentioned, Tyla and Emma did a lot of work on those draft survey reports. They put together a lot of really good information, and they've been extremely helpful putting together these charts and everything else. So, if either of you have any comments you'd like to share with the board about some of the things that you picked up in this experience?
I think based off of what we looked at today, I think we're really gonna have to focus on getting more supervisors. We're struggling there. Our poor non-clinicals, they're trying to find them. I think it would be good for us to brainstorm maybe how to get supervisors more willing to give their time. I think would be a really good place to start from there.
Thank you, Emma. Tyler, do you have any thoughts or any takeaways from going through and reviewing a lot of this information?
I guess same sentiments. I also do clinical training plans, so I see the struggle for supervisors and supervisees a lot. I think there is a huge common response about insurance. Not much we can do about that. But I don't know if there's some way that we can speak to other people who are on other committees to talk about even just giving people who are coming into the field more information about insurance and what that looks like for them.
So you're finding that as like a knowledge base, they want more education.
Yeah.
I just want to understand your comment. Okay.
Well, like I said, Tyler and Emma did a lot of work, and I know sometimes these board meetings, you may just hear from me or see me, or Leslie sometimes, or, Cindy, but really all the members of the staff do excellent work, and just kind of wanted to share some of their thoughts with you and highlight some of the work they did, just because the staff does a lot of really good work here, and we wanted to bring that to your attention and just kind of highlight the work they did as well.
One other comment, would there be value once the addiction counseling survey is done to put the professionals side by side in some way so we could look at them? Okay.
And I am working on that.
Okay.
Yeah, to
Okay,
get
great.
a more specific,
Okay.
looking at everyone and exactly how they compare,
Thank you.
Well, thank you for your work on that. I was surprised at how low the telehealth numbers were. I expected those to be higher. And then the idea that some people didn't know what area they were, like a rural or frontier, maybe that's just, like not understanding what those distinctions are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there was another question, it's an open field question, which said, in what counties do you primarily practice in? And some of them practice in a wide variety. So I can imagine some people may have been torn if they were saying, you want me to pick one that I primarily practice in, but I feel like I'm split all across the state. So.
That makes sense. It was really interesting information. Appreciate your gathering and sharing that with us. Are we ready to move?
I think so. We'll just bring back a part 2 and further analyze the data and then focus on the open field responses for next time.
Perfect. That takes us to a discussion on board policy for reconsideration requests in disciplinary cases.
Yes, and so this is basically when someone, just to kind of compare it, I'll start with the process the board has established when someone applies for licensure. If someone applies for licensure and they either are denied or they are approved with conditions, that person has a legal order that is sent to them, and they have the ability to appeal the board's decision. And if they appeal the board's decision, it would go to a hearing panel of board members, and the board established a process for that. And the person also, if they are denied at the hearing or there's an agreement from the hearing, they have the ability to request something called reconsideration. And the board established a process for reconsideration request where one board member, usually the presiding officer for the hearing panel or the chair of the board, would serve as the person to review the information and make the decision on behalf of the hearing panel. They also have the option to refer it back to the full board if they feel it's appropriate to do so for the reconsideration request. But that has been basically something the board had put into place about 2 years ago. For disciplinary matters, if someone gets a disciplinary complaint against them and the complaint review committee meets and decides there should be a disciplinary order, that is sent to them in a similar method. So it is a legally drafted order, which gives them the ability to appeal that decision. If they appeal that decision, instead of that going to a subset of the board has held that that should go to the Office of Administrative Hearings in most cases to be reviewed in that capacity. However, in those orders, it also does give them the ability to request reconsideration. And so there's also time limits for requesting a hearing or reconsideration. And so a member who may have a disciplinary hearing or a disciplinary matter may not request a hearing, but may instead request reconsideration. And the board really has not had at least any of these types of requests in the last 5 years, but we need to put in place a policy for how to handle these. And so if a matter is not appealed to OAH, the Office of Administrative Hearings, but someone does request reconsideration, the question is, how should the board handle this? Now, if you wanted to have a similar policy to what you do in licensing hearings, you could have one member of the complaint review committee review these reconsideration requests. And I think that would be most likely to be the chair of the CRC. If the chair of the CRC does not feel comfortable with that after reviewing the situation, the chair could refer it to the full CRC. And I think Tim might be able to clarify this too. Under the CAPA, there's lots of choices the board has in terms of how you'd want to handle this. But I thought I'd put forth this proposal because I think it's similar to how the board wanted to handle those subsets of the board for the license hearing panels and also the reconsideration request. So I think a model like this would be somewhat consistent with what the board has done before. In looking back through minutes, I couldn't see the board really defined how they wanted reconsideration request of disciplinary hearings to go, or disciplinary matters, I should say. So, Tim, do you want to clarify anything further on that?
Yeah, well, I think you put it very well. The only thing I'd add is I think familiarity is important. Cindy and Joan put together pretty extensive packets that go to the complaint review committee, sometimes hundreds of pages. And so there's a lot of work that goes into it. And I think that someone that's familiar with the summary proceeding order and the underlying file could be important. Now, if a matter would go to an evidentiary hearing before the Office of Administrative Hearings, then you're going to have, in addition to the investigative file, you could have dozens of exhibits, which would be typical. You'd also have a hearing transcript, testimony from multiple witnesses. And so, that's additional work and time that someone's going to have to devote. And for that reason, I think having a good baseline to start from makes good sense, whether it's the CRC chair or the CRC as a whole. It could help streamline the process because under the reconsideration statute, there's time constraints that apply. I think, Dave, it's a 20-day time limit, if I recall correctly. And so it's something that, does need attention and acted upon relatively quickly.
So I guess the question before the board is that proposal satisfactory? If you would like to do something different, of course you can. If you have questions for Tim on alternatives, but I thought I'd go ahead and bring you one proposal that seems consistent with what we've done in the past. Let's see what your thoughts are on it.
I think it makes sense. And just because of the time constraints, I wouldn't say the full CRC. I would say the chair, unless there is something that's complicated like, for example, I might not feel comfortable in that situation. But that makes the most sense to me.
Any other board members want to weigh in or have alternate
Agree
thoughts?
with that. I think it's streamlined. It makes sense, especially like Mary said, with time constraint that is involved.
Okay, well, it seems like there is consensus to do that. So we will make sure that it is clearly articulated in the minutes, and that way it can be a reference for our practice going forward. And so I appreciate all of you considering that and giving us direction.
Very good. Takes us to review and approval of draft regulation language. The first being AR 1024-5A master's level psychology.
That is the examination regulation. the committee had requested that the board approve the ability of LMLPs who are working toward their clinical license, the ability to sit for the exam before they've completed their hours and apply for the LCP. I looked back at the minutes after this, I found them, of course. And it just said LMLP, so I wasn't sure if what the board's preference would be, if it would be someone who's working on a training plan. I said practicing under a board-approved training plan, or if you just wanted to leave it as they were licensed permanently or temporarily at the lower level, and allow them to sit.
So you're talking about the possibility of somebody sitting for the exam who's not working under a plan?
Training plan, yes.
Which would be like what social workers can do, right? I mean, social workers, they can sit for the exam.
They have a different exam for each level.
Yeah.
So they have to wait, the
Until they're
clinical
out there.
social worker has to wait till they apply.
Gotcha.
And I will point out that the regs actually for LMLP and LMFT say that they have to meet the educational requirements to take the exam for both levels, but you can't apply for an LCP until you've finished your hours. So,
We're trying to avoid the 2-year wait.
yeah.
period. Yeah, is essentially what we're doing, and we just don't know who you want included that you want.
And just for clarification, the test for the master's level and then the clinical psychotherapist, same test, the EPPP, which is a little unique, except for the marriage and family therapy profession. We have the 2 different pass points for the LMFT license versus the clinical. So because these are the same exact tests, that's why these 2 professions seem to be unique for this aspect.
Okay.
Do we need a formal?
I think, just to know, are you comfortable with someone who holds that level of license, or do they need to be, attaining hours under a clinical?
Trying to think, why would they do it if they weren't?
There are people in doctoral programs.
Oh,
who
that's
don't
a
have
really
that
good point.
I wonder if we should include them as well.
And that
Makes
has
sense.
come up, I think, in
I get them several.
yeah,
Okay,
several
great.
yeah,
call
that
out.
makes sense then.
Okay, so just having a license
Yes,
and temporary is acceptable as well as permanent.
I would think so.
Yep.
Okay.
Anybody have any other thoughts?
And that would be for both. The next one is the clinical marriage and family therapy and marriage and family therapy. So the same, would you like that to be the same if they just have a license and haven't passed it level? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, that takes us to our last issue, which is a discussion on alternate pathways to licensure. And as you all know, we've had some prior discussions just about those individuals who aren't able to get licensed generally because of their inability to pass national exams. And we've heard information indicating how those exams might, actually, if we get rid of might, know that they have some biases built into them. And so we started talking about whether or not we should have further discussion about an alternate plan for licensure, that we would ask each of the advisory committees to add that to their agenda to see if they wanted to pursue that or not, right? So it would be specific to professions. If your advisory committee decides that's not a path they want to take, that's certainly fine. And then there would be proposals created by the advisory committees that would come back to the full board.
Yeah, advisory committees can make recommendations. So if this was something the advisory committees wanted to research and make recommendations back, they could do that. This would also give us an opportunity to reach out to the different associations and collect information on which professions have had conversations in this area, and if there's any states that are currently allowing this for their professions.
So that will just be an item we'd ask you to include on your agendas for your advisory committees, and then be prepared to report back to the full board. All right. Our next regular board meeting will be July 21st.
And
Can
as
I
we
ask a-
mentioned,
Can I ask a question real quick? Did the surveys you were reviewing for us just now in part 2, did they ask the question of those that they surveyed as to whether they thought there should be an alternative path? Because the social work survey did, and our respondents overwhelmingly said no, that they wanted to keep the test. But was that question asked in the recent surveys of the other professions?
So we didn't specifically ask the question, though a lot of people used open responses to talk about it. It was about 50-50 though. So I would say people on both sides are very, very passionate about their stance.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, and I
Okay.
definitely see it as a topic that we've talked about, how we have people maybe on temporary licenses who are in work settings and just cannot pass that exam. And if there were a way to allow them to continue to work in the field, I think it's an important workforce issue as well, as long as we can ensure some safety for those who serve.
yeah, and we want to make sure the advisory committees can have good discussions on some of these major topics. You know, one of the other factors too is that potentially if there is an alternate path that some people pursue that might make them ineligible for a multi-state compact, so that's something to consider as well. I've
Yeah,
also
it would
seen
be
some-
the case with social worker, they would be ineligible.
Yeah, and I've seen some information too, that when it comes to standardized testing, the longer someone waits to take the test, you know, the less
Yes.
likely they are to pass the test. So there's those things to be considered as part of this discussion, but I don't know that each of the advisory committees has really had a good opportunity to have a good discussion on this topic. So I will do my part to try to collect information on each of the professions, so that way the advisory committees can have some comparable information from different states. And so we'll try to have that ready for you for the June meetings.
Thank you for that.
And then for the July 21st meeting, that is a different meeting than we traditionally have. And as we referenced earlier, Dave was willing to move the board meeting a week later because of the conflict with the SIPAC annual or the mid-year meeting, which was going to be on the same day the board was going to be meeting. So appreciate you moving that, and I think that'll be helpful for us. So.
Very good. Do we have a motion to adjourn? So moved. All
Second.
right. Thank you. All in favor, say bye.
Have a good day.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So the way I read this is that essentially it's that essay component that allows them to accept. That's what's coming into their assessment. So I'm